I have built things with my hands for most of my working life, and I want to be clear about what that means before I tell you this story. I am not speaking of fine carpentry, dovetail joints, and cabinet work, and the kind of furniture that gets handed down through families. I mean the practical work of the frontier, crib barns, storage sheds, sod house additions, the occasional frame dwelling for a family that had finally saved enough to move out of the ground and into something with a wooden floor. I understand load-bearing and roof pitch, and the behavior of green cottonwood as it seasons. I understand nails, which gauge holes in what wood, and at which temperature they begin to work loose in the cold. I have been doing this work since I was 19 years old. I tell you this not to recommend myself, but to explain the particular quality of the mistake I made in the autumn of 1879. A man who knows nothing about construction can be forgiven for not recognizing a good idea when he sees one. He simply does not have the vocabulary for the judgment. But a man who has spent 30 years building structures across the Nebraska sandhills, a man who has held a plumb line in weather cold enough to freeze the string, that man has no such excuse. When he dismisses something, it is not ignorance. It is a different thing entirely. It is the confidence of accumulated knowledge applied in the wrong direction. I was 53 years old that autumn. I had built 14 barns in the sandhills. I thought I knew everything a man needed to know about keeping livestock through a Nebraska winter. I was wrong in a way that I have spent the better part of 30 years trying to understand. The sandhills are not what people from the East picture when they hear Nebraska. They think of the flat country along the Platte, the long, straight roads, the horizon like a ruled line, the sky that goes on until it becomes something else. That is not the sandhills. The sandhills are 20,000 square miles of rolling grass-covered dunes, remnants of an ancient dry period when the middle of the continent was closer to desert than to farmland. The grass came back and held the sand in place, and now the hills move in long, slow undulations, each one perhaps 30 or 40 feet high, each one presenting a slightly different face to the wind and the sun. This matters. It matters because the face a hill presents to the world determines everything about it: how it sheds rain, how deep the frost goes into it, how long the snow lies on the north side in March. Two hills 100 yards apart can behave like different countries in January. Most settlers who came to the sandhills in the 1870s looked at those hills and saw an obstacle. They wanted flat ground for crops. The hills were inconvenient, and the sandy soil beneath them was worse than inconvenient. It would not hold a corn crop through a dry August. What the land would do, what it had always done, was grow native grass. Buffalo grass and blue stem and the short, tough varieties that spread low and dense and came back every year no matter what the winter did to them. What that grass fed was cattle. And so the sandhills became cattle country, and the men and women who stayed and prospered there were the ones who learned, one way or another, to read the land. Some of them had been reading it for a long time before the settlers arrived. But that is a different story, and one I am not the right man to tell. Jan Sedlak came to the sandhills from Omaha in the spring of 1874. He was a blacksmith, a good one, quiet about it the way good craftsmen sometimes are, without the need to tell you they are good. He built his forge on the east edge of what would become Ord, and within 2 years he was the man every homesteader within 15 miles came to when a wheel wanted fixing or a plow blade needed drawing out. He spoke English with a heavy Czech accent and did not waste it on conversation. He did his work. He priced it fairly. He was trusted. His wife, Marta, had come with him from Moravia, from a village in the eastern part of Bohemia that I cannot pronounce even after having the name explained to me 3 or 4 times. She was 4 years younger than Jan and had grown up in the household of her father, who built things, not in the way I build things. Her father was a traditional Moravian craftsman, the kind of man who knows how earth and stone and timber behave in deep cold, who has inherited a body of practical knowledge about the ground itself that goes back several generations and has never been written down anywhere because the men who held it did not write things down. They built them. Marta learned from her father the way children learn from parents who work with their hands. She stood beside him and watched and carried and held things in place and handed him what he needed, and over many years the knowledge went into her hands and her eyes without ever passing through a textbook. She had not thought about this knowledge in some time. Nebraska was not Moravia, and the problem of surviving a frontier winter occupied most of her attention in ways that did not require her to reach back into her father's methods. But the knowledge was there. It had not gone anywhere. Jan Sedlak died in July of 1879. Typhoid fever, the same illness that moved through our part of Nebraska that summer, like something with a purpose. He was sick for 11 days and gone on the 12th, and Marta buried him in the Lutheran section of the Ord Cemetery with Lucy beside her. Lucy being their daughter, 16 years old that year, born in Nebraska, and as fluent in English as anyone in the county, which would matter considerably in the months that followed. Jan left behind no debt. He also left behind no surplus. There was the forge, which Marta could not operate alone and could not sell quickly. There was the homestead claim, 160 acres, a sod house, a hand-dug well. There were 23 head of cattle, a mixed herd of shorthorn crosses that Jan had been building for 3 years, the real asset of the operation, the thing that could be turned into money in Omaha if they survived long enough to be sold. And there was the problem that Jan had known about since early summer and had not yet solved when the fever took him. The problem was the cattle barn. What they had was a structure Jan had thrown up in the spring of 1877, a 3-sided cottonwood frame with a sod roof, adequate for a Nebraska autumn, inadequate for what a Nebraska winter could become when it decided to become serious. Jan had been planning to rebuild it that fall. He had been thinking about the design since March. He had spoken to me about it twice, and I had given him a price on materials, milled lumber from the yard in Omaha, hauled up by freight wagon, enough for a proper enclosed structure with a plank floor and a tin roof. The cost would have been somewhere between $30 and $35, depending on the lumber prices that particular month. Jan died in July. Marta had the money, not easily, but she had it, set aside from the previous year's cattle sales. $35 was not beyond her reach. But it was now late September, and the lumber was in Omaha, and the freight wagon came to Ord twice a month if the roads were good, and the roads were not always good. The ground in the sandhills freezes unevenly, starting from the surface down, and once the frost gets below 6 inches, digging a proper foundation becomes a different kind of work entirely. By the time lumber arrived and a crew could be assembled, I was occupied through mid-October with another job 15 miles east, and there was no other carpenter in the area at the time. The ground might already be working against them. This was the real constraint. Not money. Time. There were perhaps 5 weeks before the first hard freeze, and the clock on that estimate was not reliable. I had seen the first killing cold come to the sandhills in late October. I had seen it hold off until December. The almanac said one thing. The sandhills did what they chose. 23 head of cattle in a 3-sided shelter when the temperature dropped to 30 below would not survive. I knew this. Marta knew this. Lucy, who had grown up watching her father's careful preparations for each winter, knew this better than she wanted to. I first saw Marta Sedlak on a Tuesday morning in the last week of September. I was riding north along the creek road toward my current job, and her homestead was on the way. I saw her from perhaps 200 yards, a figure standing alone on the crest of the nearest rise on the south side of her property, not moving, looking down at the ground. I stopped. I watched for a moment, expecting her to walk somewhere or bend to examine something. She did neither. She simply stood, with her hands in her apron, and looked at the ground at her feet. I rode over because it seemed odd enough to warrant it. She was a solid-built woman, medium height, with the hands of someone who had been working since childhood, not rough in the way that comes from neglect, but worn in the way that comes from use. She had gray eyes that had a particular quality I noticed even then. When she looked at something, it seemed less like looking and more like measuring. She did not appear startled when I rode up. She glanced at me, nodded in a way that indicated she had known I was coming for some time, and returned her attention to the ground. I asked her what she was doing. She said something in Czech that I did not understand. Then she called toward the house, and Lucy came out, a tall girl with her father's quiet manner and her mother's eyes, and translated. She says she is listening to the ground. I looked at Marta. I looked at the ground, which was grass and sand, and did not appear to be saying anything of particular interest. I said, "Listening for what?" Lucy put the question to her mother. Marta answered briefly, still looking down. "For where it stays warm," Lucy said. I did not know what to do with that answer, so I touched my hat, said good morning to them both, and rode on toward my job. I thought about it for the rest of the ride. I decided that the woman was grieving, or perhaps simply eccentric, or possibly both, which was understandable enough given her circumstances. I did not think she was about to do something useful. I was wrong about that, in the same way I was wrong about nearly everything else that autumn. I heard about the conversation with Reverend Aldgate a few days later, from Lucy herself, when I stopped at the Sedlak place on my way home from the job to the east. Aldgate was the Methodist minister in Ord, a decent man, English-born, thorough in his convictions, and genuinely attentive to his congregation. He had come to the homestead to offer what he considered a reasonable arrangement. Lucy could board with the Hadley family in town through the winter in exchange for domestic work, while Marta might find a situation with one of the ranching families east of Ord, tending house and cooking in exchange for room and board. The cattle could be sold at whatever the autumn price offered, which would not be good, but would be something. It was the kind of offer that looked after everyone and required no one to do anything uncomfortable. Marta had heard this out. Then she had picked up her spade and walked toward the South Hill, and Reverend Aldgate had eventually returned to town. When I asked Lucy how her mother had responded to the offer, the girl thought carefully before answering, the particular care of someone translating not a language, but a disposition. She said she had a problem and she was solving it, Lucy told me. She said taking the Reverend's offer would mean letting someone else solve a different problem, the one about what she is. I rode home thinking about that. It took me the better part of 3 days to understand what she meant. The problem of what she was, a Czech widow, a foreigner, a woman alone, was a problem that could either be solved for her, on someone else's terms, or solved by her, on her own. Marta Sedlak had decided, without apparent anguish and without any great announcement, that she would be the one doing the solving. She had a hill. She had a spade. She had something in her hands and her memory that had come from her father's hands and his father's before him, something about the way earth behaves in deep cold. 5 weeks before the first hard freeze, she had already started. By the 1st of October, she had dug 3 holes. I know this because I passed the Sedlak property 4 times that week, twice going out to my job east of Ord and twice coming back. And each time I looked toward the south rise out of a curiosity I would not have admitted to anyone at the time. The first morning there was 1 hole, perhaps 18 inches deep on the eastern slope of the rise. By Thursday, there were 3, positioned at intervals across the face of the hill, like the marks a surveyor leaves when he is trying to understand the land before he commits to anything permanent. On Friday afternoon, I stopped. Marta was crouched beside the most westerly of the 3 holes, and she was doing something I had not seen before and have thought about many times since. She had her right forearm extended into the hole up to the elbow, and she was holding it there still, with her eyes closed and her head slightly tilted the way a person tilts their head when they are listening to something faint and do not want to interfere with the listening by moving. After perhaps 30 seconds, she withdrew her arm and made a small notation in the dirt beside the hole with a stick, a mark I did not understand, and moved to the next hole and repeated the process. Lucy was sitting on a rock a few yards away, watching her mother with the patient expression of someone who had seen this before and understood it even if she could not have fully explained it. I got down from my horse. I asked Lucy what her mother was doing. Lucy said, "Feeling the temperature at different depths." I said, "Why the forearm and not the hand?" Lucy relayed the question. Marta answered without looking up. "She says the hand is calloused. The wrist is still sensitive. She can feel a difference of 2 or 3 degrees with her wrist that her hand would miss." I stood there watching Marta work her way from the 3rd hole to the 1st and back again, her forearm going in and coming out, the small marks accumulating in the dirt beside each excavation. After a while, I asked what she was looking for. "The place where the ground stays warm," Lucy said. Then, after a pause, as though adding what her mother had not said but meant, "She already knows it's there. She's finding exactly where." There is a thing that happens under the ground in the sandhills that I did not properly understand until Marta Sedlak demonstrated it to me, and which I have since confirmed well enough that I am confident in the explanation. The frost comes into the ground from above, from the cold air pressing down on the surface, and it advances downward through the winter, a slow front of freezing that moves at a rate depending on how cold it gets and how long the cold holds. In the clay-heavy soils along the Loop River, that frost front can push down 4 or 5 feet in a bad winter. But the sandhills are sand, and sand has a different relationship with cold than clay does. Sand drains. Sand has air between its particles, and those air spaces slow the transmission of cold considerably. In the sandhills, even in the worst winters, the frost line does not go below 3 feet, sometimes not even that deep. Below 3 feet, the ground temperature remains between 34 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit, not warm by any comfortable measure, but above freezing and, more importantly, stable. It does not vary by season the way the air does. In July, that deep ground is cooler than the surface. In January, it is warmer. It maintains its own steady temperature regardless of what the atmosphere is doing overhead. Marta Sedlak knew this, not from a book. There was no book she had read on the subject, and she would not have described the mechanism in the terms I have just used. She knew it from her father, who had built sklepeni, the Moravian earth-sheltered cellars, in the hills of Bohemia for 30 years, and who had taught her the same way she would later teach others, not with words, but with her forearm extended into the ground until her wrist told her what it found. The Moravia of her childhood was not the sandhills of Nebraska. The geology was different, and the climate was different, and the particular character of the cold was different. But the principle was the same. Below a certain depth, the earth keeps its own counsel. It does not respond to the sky. It holds a temperature that is neither comfortable nor lethal. And if you can build 3 walls of a structure from that earth, if you can make the ground itself into the wall, then whatever is inside will never be as cold as the air outside, regardless of how cold that air becomes. She had been looking for the right hill. By the time I stopped to watch her work the 3rd probe hole, she had already found it. The westernmost hole had a different feel at depth than the other 2. This was what her wrist had been telling her, and what the accumulating marks in the dirt were recording. The eastern slope of the rise shed water away from the draw, which meant drier soil and less frost penetration. The face of the hill at that particular point was oriented toward the southeast, not due south, but angled at perhaps 20 degrees east of south. I asked about this later, and Lucy translated the answer carefully. In winter, the sun rises in the southeast and stays low all day. A wall facing due south gets the most sun at noon, when it is already the warmest part of the day. A wall facing southeast gets sun from 8 in the morning, when the animals are coldest and the air is coldest. The warmth comes when it is most needed. I had been building barns for 30 years, and I had never thought about this. I had oriented structures away from the prevailing northwest wind, which is the obvious and correct thing to do. But I had never thought about which hours of winter sunlight were most valuable, or calculated my wall orientation accordingly. She had not calculated it either exactly. She had observed it. There was a difference. On the 5th of October, she began to dig in earnest. The plan she had settled on was not complicated, but it required precision in its simplicity. She would excavate a rectangular space into the face of the hill, 24 feet long, 18 feet wide, 4.5 feet deep, cut back into the slope so that the north, east, and west walls were living earth. The floor of the excavation would sit at the level where the ground temperature held steady. The south face would be open, framed with cottonwood poles and hung with doubled burlap stuffed with dry grass, which could be pushed aside for access. The roof would be built from materials the land provided. No milled lumber, no tin, no cut nails except for the frame of the south opening, which she had budgeted carefully. I watched her pace out the dimensions on the morning she began digging. She did this with a length of knotted rope, the knots spaced at measured intervals, and she was precise about it in a way that reminded me of the most careful craftsman I had worked alongside. Each corner was checked twice. The orientation was confirmed with a small compass she took from her apron pocket and held level in her palm for a long moment before she was satisfied. Then she drove a stake at each corner, strung a line between them, and picked up her spade. Lucy dug beside her. They worked from the center outward toward the hill, removing the surface layer of sand and grass first and stacking it to the north side in a long berm that would eventually become a windbreak. The deeper material, the denser, slightly darker sand that held more structure, went to the east side in a separate pile. I watched this for perhaps 20 minutes on my way past that morning. I told myself I was only curious. The truth is that I was trying to find the flaw, the thing that would confirm my initial judgment, which was that the undertaking was misguided and would fail in some way that could have been avoided by building a proper frame barn with milled lumber and a tin roof. I could not immediately find the flaw, which bothered me more than finding it would have. Dan Hawk appeared on the third day. Don was a Dutchman who had come to the Sandhills in 1871 and had more experience with the land than almost anyone else in the county. He was 50 years old that year, wide through the shoulders, economical in his movements and in his speech. He had built a successful cattle operation on the flat ground north of Ord by the straightforward method of paying close attention to what worked and discarding what did not, without much sentiment in either direction. I do not know what drew him to the Sedlock property that particular morning. The word that traveled through a frontier community was a thing without a clear mechanism. It moved faster than news had any right to move in a place with no telegraph and no daily paper, through some network of observation and inference that I never entirely understood. In any case, Don Hook arrived at 9:30 on the third morning of excavation, rode his horse to the edge of the work, and sat in the saddle for perhaps an hour without saying anything. Marta did not acknowledge him. She continued digging. After an hour, Dan dismounted, tied his horse to a fence post, picked up the spare spade that was leaning against the grass pile, and began compacting the east wall of the excavation, not the digging, the shaping. He pressed the flat of the spade against the cut face of earth and worked it in slow vertical strokes, consolidating the material into a surface that was firmer and less likely to crumble. He had not been invited. He had not asked. He simply looked at the work, understood what was needed, and provided it. Marta glanced at him once. She nodded. She kept digging. I asked Don later what had made him come over. He was not a man who explained himself easily in English, and he took a moment before he answered. "She has done this before," he said. "Not here, but somewhere. You can see it in how she moves. She is not experimenting. She is remembering." I thought about that. I had been watching the same woman for 3 days and had not seen what he saw in the first hour. There was something instructive in that, though I was not quite ready to receive the instruction. The east wall gave them trouble on the third day. The sand in the southeast corner of the excavation was finer grained than the rest, more loosely packed, with a higher proportion of the very small particles that did not consolidate under pressure the way coarser sand did. When Don worked his spade against it, the face slumped rather than firming. When Marta pressed her palm against it, a section the size of a dinner plate slid down and had to be cleared from the floor. She stopped work on that corner. She crouched and looked at the material for some time. Then she collected a double handful of it and carried it to the creek, which ran perhaps 60 yards east of the site, and she held the sand under the water and worked it between her fingers and brought it back up to her face and looked at it closely. She went back to the excavation. She dug a small test hole in the floor of the east corner, perhaps 8 inches deep, and examined what came up. She did this twice more at different points along the east wall. Then she set her spade down and stood with her hands in her apron for a few minutes, which I had come to recognize as the posture she took when she was working something out. Lucy had been watching from the grass berm. She came over. They spoke quietly in Czech. Then Lucy looked at me. I was sitting on an upturned bucket by that point, having abandoned the pretense of being somewhere else, and she said, "My mother needs to bring clay from the creek bank. She will mix it with the sand here and let it dry for 2 days before she continues the wall. The clay particles will bind the sand particles together." I asked how much clay. Lucy consulted with her mother. Enough to change the color. This turned out to mean 3 days of carrying. They used a pair of wooden buckets and made the trip to the creek bank and back perhaps 40 times over the following days, bringing up the dark, slightly sticky material from below the waterline and working it into the loose sand of the east corner in layers, mixing each layer by hand before adding the next. The result, when it dried, was a wall face that held when pressed, that did not crumble when Don ran the flat of his spade against it. It was not elegant. It was improvised from a problem they had not anticipated, but it was correct. I could see that even then, and the fact that Marta had diagnosed the problem, identified the material she needed, and resolved it in 3 days without altering the fundamental design told me something about the quality of her thinking. She was not building from a plan she had memorized. She was building from principles she understood well enough to adapt. This was when I stopped waiting for the flaw and started paying attention to something else. On the 8th day, she began the roof. The south frame was up. 4 cottonwood poles, the straightest she and Lucy had found along the creek, mortised together at the corners and set into the ground 2 feet deep at each post. The burlap door hung from the top rail. The 3 earth walls were finished and drying, their surfaces packed to a consistency closer to sandstone than to loose ground. The roof was the part I had been most skeptical about. A roof must carry load, the weight of the material itself, plus whatever accumulates on top of it in winter, and distribute that load to the walls. With no interior posts and no ridge beam, the only way to make this work was to build the roof as a unified structure rather than a collection of separate components. The kind of roof that carries its own weight by virtue of how its parts are bound together. What she built was this. First, cottonwood poles laid across the top of the excavation in parallel rows, spaced 8 inches apart, spanning from the north wall of the hill to the top of the south frame. These were the substrate, not a finished roof but a platform to build on. Then the first layer of sod cut in blocks from the surface material she had set aside at the beginning. Here was the detail that stopped me when I saw it. She laid the sod grass side down, every piece throughout the entire first layer. The roots faced up and the soil faced down against the poles. I asked Lucy why. The answer came back. The grass is dead on top. It will dry and fall away. The grass on the bottom is still alive. It will grow downward through the poles and anchor itself. By spring, the roots will have woven together under the poles and the first layer will not move. A living structure, not a collection of cut material placed in position, but a biological process initiated and then left to complete itself. I had been building roofs for 30 years with sawn lumber and tin sheeting. It had never once occurred to me that a roof might finish building itself after the carpenter walked away. Over the sod, she poured a layer of the dry, fine sand from the excavation, 6 inches deep, filling the gaps between the root-down blocks and creating a layer of insulation that also added weight. Over the sand went the second layer of sod, this time grass side up, so that it would root into the sand layer below and present a living surface to the weather above. When the two grass layers grew toward each other through the sand, and by the following spring they had, exactly as she had said, the roof became a single integrated piece. Rain struck it and soaked in and was held. Snow settled on it and did not slide, but also did not penetrate. The weight was distributed across the entire surface and carried to the walls not as a series of point loads, but as an even, continuous pressure that the packed earth walls were far better suited to carry than any frame of green cottonwood would have been. I understood this eventually. I did not understand it that week, watching her lay the first sod blocks face down and wondering what she thought she was doing. There was a great deal I did not understand that week. She finished the roof on the 14th of October. I know the date because I wrote it in my work ledger that evening, not as a record of anything I had built, but because I had developed the habit of noting what I had seen at the Sedlak property each time I passed, in the same column where I recorded lumber costs and nail counts and the other ordinary data of my trade. I am not entirely sure why I started doing this. Partly it was the instinct of a craftsman who has learned that observation is the cheapest form of education. Partly it was something I did not want to name at the time, which was that I had begun to suspect I was watching something worth recording. The structure completed was not a beautiful thing. It sat in the face of the hill the way a root cellar sits, half swallowed by the earth, its south face of cottonwood poles and doubled burlap, the only part that looked like something a person had made rather than something that had simply grown there. The roof was a low mound of sod and sand that in a month would be difficult to distinguish from the surrounding hillside. There were no windows, there was no weather vane, no indication of compass orientation visible from the outside. From the road it looked like a slight irregularity in the slope of the hill. 23 head of shorthorn crosses lived inside it. I had counted them going in on the 12th, walking through the burlap door one at a time in the unhurried manner of cattle that have decided something is acceptable. The interior was dim and smelled of turned earth and animal warmth and the dry grass stuffing of the door panels. The floor was the original ground surface, packed hard by the excavation process and covered with a thin layer of creek sand for drainage. It was, by any conventional measure, a rudimentary facility. Marta walked in behind the last animal, stood in the center of the space for a moment, and then crouched and pressed her wrist to the north wall, the deepest wall, the one that went straight back into the hill, and held it there. She stayed in that position for perhaps 20 seconds. Then she stood, walked back out through the burlap, and went inside the house. That was all. No ceremony, no visible satisfaction, just the check, and the result of the check, and then the ordinary business of the rest of the day. There was one problem she had not yet solved, and I give myself partial credit for noticing it before she told me, which was the following Monday when I stopped and Lucy came out to talk. The problem was air. 23 animals in an enclosed space generate a considerable amount of moisture from their breathing and their bodies, and a considerable amount of ammonia from their waste. In a well-ventilated frame barn, these move out through the gaps that are the inevitable consequence of green lumber drying and shrinking over its first winter. The boards pull apart slightly at the edges, the roof panels develop small separations, and the resulting air exchange, while unintended, serves the animals tolerably well. In a structure with packed earth walls and a sod roof, there are no such gaps. The walls do not shrink, the roof does not separate. The seal is, if anything, too complete. Ammonia in high concentrations is hard on the lungs of cattle, not immediately lethal, but corrosive over time, the kind of damage that shows up in spring as animals that are weaker than they should be, more susceptible to the respiratory illnesses that move through a herd when the snow melts and the temperature swings become violent. Marta knew this. Her father had known it before her. The solution was 2 openings, each approximately the size of a man's spread hand, cut through the upper portion of the east and west earth walls. Not at the top, which would allow rain to enter, but at the highest point of the wall just below the roof junction, angled slightly upward so that water ran out rather than in. These openings were fitted with loose plugs of bundled grass that could be removed in summer for greater circulation and replaced in winter to reduce the gap to a permeable filter rather than an open hole. The physics of this, as Marta explained it through Lucy, was simple enough that I was embarrassed not to have thought of it myself. The warm air produced by the animals, warmer than the surrounding earth, lighter than the cold air that seeped in at ground level through the base of the burlap door, rose naturally toward the roof and found the vent openings. The cold incoming air, denser, sank and distributed itself along the floor where the animals stood. The exchange was slow and continuous and required no mechanical assistance of any kind. Heavy air goes down, Lucy translated. Light air goes up. The holes are only at the top because that is where the light air is. I wrote this in my ledger. I had built 14 barns and had never designed a ventilation system based on the differential behavior of warm and cold air. I had put in windows and left gaps and called it ventilation. What Marta had built was something that worked by principle rather than by accident. The last week of October was warm, unseasonably so, in the way that the sandhills occasionally produce a false reprieve between autumn and the real onset of winter. The temperature stayed above 40 degrees through 5 consecutive days, and the sky was a clear and slightly washed-out blue that had too much winter in it to be mistaken for summer despite the warmth. The grass on the south-facing slopes caught the low sun and held a color close to gold. It was during this warm spell that Reverend Aldgate came to the Sedlock property for the second time. He did not come to argue or to repeat his earlier offer, which Marta had declined without discussion. He came, as best I could determine from what Lucy told me afterward, simply to look. He walked around the outside of the structure, examined the south frame, pressed his palm against the sod roof in 2 or 3 places, and stood for a while looking at the berm of excavated material along the north side that had continued to settle and compact through the autumn until it resembled a natural feature of the hillside rather than a construction artifact. He did not go inside. He did not speak to Marta, who was working at the far end of the property, and did not come over. After perhaps 20 minutes, he walked back to his horse and rode toward Ord. Lucy told me he had said one thing quietly, mostly to himself, as he was preparing to leave. "It does look rather permanent," he had said. Coming from Aldgate, I understood this as a significant concession. He had expected it to look improvised and temporary, because that was what his framework told him a structure built by a widow with no money and no carpenter ought to look like. It did not look that way. It looked like something that had found its place in the landscape and intended to remain there. November arrived with a week of hard rain, followed by a hard frost that took the remaining leaves from the cottonwoods along the creek in a single night. This was the normal progression of a sandhills autumn, and nothing about it was alarming in itself. I had my own preparations to manage: storm banking around the foundation of my house, firewood consolidated under the lean-to roof, the chimney cleaned, and the stovepipe joints checked. The community of Ord went through these rituals with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned that winter in this country did not accommodate postponement. What was different that November was the behavior of the cattle. Not the Sedlock cattle. Those I had no direct report on through most of the month, though I passed the property often enough. I mean the cattle across the county generally. The shorthorn crosses and the longhorn grades and the mixed stock that the homesteaders were running on the grass. They were eating more than usual for early November. Not ravenously, not in a way that suggested illness, but with a purposeful increase in consumption that the men who watched them closely recognized as the kind of preparation animals make before cold that is coming rather than cold that has already arrived. Old Gregor Meshek, who ran cattle north of the creek and had been in Nebraska longer than most, told me in the first week of November that his animals were putting on fat at a rate he had not seen since the winter of 1872, which had been the worst of his time in the territory. He was buying supplemental hay from a farm near Burwell, more than he had budgeted for, because he trusted what the animals were telling him more than he trusted the almanac. I noted this in my ledger. Don Hook told me at the same time that he had rebanked his barn with extra sod on the north and west sides, work he had not planned to do that year. He had done it, he said, because of something he could not precisely articulate, a quality of the northwest wind that had begun to appear in the afternoons, a specific dry cold that came without moisture and without the smell of snow. Wind that was not preparing weather. Wind that simply was cold, without drama or announcement, as though it had decided on a temperature and intended to hold it for some time. I had felt the same wind and had not known what to make of it. Don made it into action. He spent 4 days in early November moving sod and had his barn banked before the middle of the month. I did not bank my barn. I had built it well, I told myself, and it did not need the additional insulation. This was the same confidence that had led me to dismiss Marta's work in September, and I mention it here because the pattern of my thinking that autumn seems worth documenting honestly. I was not a stupid man, and I was not a negligent one. I was a man whose knowledge was real, but whose imagination of what that knowledge could miss was insufficiently developed. On the 12th of November, I stopped at the Sedlock property in the early afternoon. Marta was not at the excavation. She and Lucy were both at the house, and when Lucy came out to speak with me, she had the careful expression she wore when she was translating more than words. I asked how the animals were. "All healthy," Lucy said. "My mother checked the wall temperature this morning with her wrist. The north wall, the deep one, is 37 degrees, the same as it was in October." I asked if that was what she expected. She expected 36 to 38, so yes. I stood by my horse for a moment. The southeast face of the hill above the structure caught the afternoon sun at a low angle, and I could see how the orientation Marta had chosen maximized that exposure for exactly the hours Lucy had described weeks earlier. The berm to the north cast its shadow away from the structure. There was no wind on that particular slope where the surrounding topography deflected it. She had read all of this in September. She had stood on that hill with her hands in her apron and her eyes on the ground, and read the temperature and the frost depth and the sun angle and the wind pattern, and had found in the combination of these things the conditions her father's knowledge required. She had not invented anything. She had recognized something the land was already offering, and she had built a structure to accept the offer. I rode home that afternoon with the specific discomfort of a man who is beginning to understand that he has been measuring everything by the wrong standard. 3 days later, the mail rider came through Ord with word from the settlements north of the Loop. Families up there were reporting a cold snap unlike anything in recent memory, the temperature dropping not in the violent way of a blizzard, but steadily, incrementally, a degree or two each night, the way a fire goes out when no one is watching. Livestock losses were beginning. The rider said the temperature at the Lute River crossing the previous morning had been 18 degrees below zero. He said it without drama, the way men on that route learn to say things, because the news that matters on the frontier is never improved by the manner of its delivery. 18 below at the Lute River meant something was coming south. I went home and banked my barn that afternoon, 6 weeks after Dan Hook had banked his, and stood in the cold afterward, looking at the ordinary frame structure I had built with milled lumber and tin roofing and cut nails and 30 years of experience, and thought about the packed earth walls of the Sedlock excavation and what 37 degrees felt like on the inside of a wrist. The cold arrived on the 12th of January and did not leave for 14 days. I want to be precise about this because the precision matters. It was not a blizzard. There was no dramatic weather event to point to afterward, no single night of catastrophic wind and snow that could be named and remembered as a discrete disaster. There was only the temperature, dropping each evening by 2 or 3 degrees, the thermometer outside the general store in Ord recording the descent with the indifferent accuracy of an instrument that has no opinion about what it measures. -8 on the 12th, -14 on the 13th, -19 on the 15th. The sky stayed clear throughout, a hard, depthless blue in the daytime and a black salted with stars at night, the kind of cold clarity that looks almost pleasant from inside a warm room and is lethal to the unprepared. On the 5th day, Dan Hoke's best cow died. He found her in the morning lying on the floor of his frame barn with the stillness that is different from sleep, in a way that any farmer recognizes before he is fully awake. The barn had been banked with extra sod in November, and it was the best constructed frame building of its type within 10 miles, and the temperature inside it that morning was 11 degrees below zero. The differential between inside and outside was perhaps 8 degrees. 8 degrees is not nothing, but it is not enough. I went to see Dan that afternoon. He was in the barn, working with a methodical quietness that I recognized as the behavior of a man who has accepted a loss and is already thinking about what comes next. He did not speak about the cow except to say her name once, which I will not record here because it was said in Dutch and was not said for my benefit. I asked him if the other animals were holding. For now, he said. 2 days later, Reverend Aldgate lost both of his young steers, animals he had been running on the church's small pasture, intended for sale in the spring to fund repairs to the building. I heard about this from the minister himself, who came to find me with a practicality that I had not expected from him. He wanted to know if anything could be done to the structure to improve its performance before the cold broke. I told him honestly that green cottonwood frame construction had reached its limit in conditions like these, and that there was nothing a carpenter could add at this point that would make a meaningful difference. The building was what it was. By the end of the first week, the informal count that moved through our community, the way all information moved, person to person, accumulating and sometimes losing accuracy along the way, suggested that 40 or more head of cattle had died in the county. The number would eventually be confirmed as higher. On the 8th day, I went to the Sedlak property with a thermometer in my coat pocket. I did not announce my intention to anyone. I rode over in the mid-morning when the temperature had climbed from the overnight low of -32 degrees to what the thermometer at the store was reading as -26. I tied my horse at the fence post where Don had tied his in October and walked to the south face of the hill. The burlap door panels hung still in the cold air. I could see from several feet away that they were not stiff with frost on the inside face, a thing that happened to the burlap partitions in ordinary barns when the temperature dropped far enough. I pushed through them. The heat reached my face before my eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Not warmth. Heat is the wrong word for what it was, if heat implies comfort or abundance. But compared to the air I had just walked out of, what I encountered inside that structure was something so different in character that my body registered it as heat before my mind had caught up. I stood still and let my eyes adjust and breathed the air, which smelled of cattle and dry earth and the faint ammonia that the vent openings were managing without eliminating entirely. 23 animals stood in the dimness. Their breathing was the slow, unremarkable breathing of animals at rest, not the rapid, shallow respiration that cold-stressed cattle produce. They turned their heads to look at me with the mild curiosity of livestock that are not suffering. I took the thermometer from my pocket and held it at chest height in the center of the space. After 2 minutes, I read it. I read it again. Then I held it against the north wall, the deep wall, the one that went back into the hill, and waited another 2 minutes and read it there as well. 38 degrees at chest height, 39 degrees at the north wall, outside -26. A difference of 64 degrees, maintained without fuel, without heat source of any kind beyond the animals themselves, and the steady thermal output of the earth that surrounded 3 walls and the floor and the roof of the structure on every side. I stood there for some time. I was aware of Marta Sedlak standing near the south frame, watching me with the patient expression she seemed to reserve for moments when she was waiting for someone to finish arriving at a conclusion she had reached some time ago. I did not say anything to her. There was nothing I could usefully say. I put the thermometer back in my pocket and walked out through the burlap and stood in the -26-degree air and felt it close around me again like a fact. The cold broke on the 26th of January, as abruptly as it had arrived, the temperature climbing 20 degrees in a single afternoon, and a warm front bringing the smell of distant moisture from the southwest. The final count for the county was 61 head of cattle lost. Every one of them died in a frame structure. Every one of them died in a building that a carpenter, myself included, would have called adequate before that January. The Sedlock herd, 23 animals, 23 survivors. Word of this moved through the community in the way that verified facts move, more slowly than rumor but with greater permanence. By February, 4 men had come to the Sedlock property to look at the structure, and Marta had shown each of them what she had built and why, with Lucy translating the technical particulars. She charged nothing. She turned no one away. She answered every question Lucy could render into English, and when a question exceeded Lucy's vocabulary, she drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick until the point was clear. Don Hook came in March, after the thaw, and spent 2 days rebuilding his cattle shelter using the principles Marta had shown him. He added a drainage channel along the south side, a detail I watched him discuss with Marta across the language barrier. A conversation conducted almost entirely through gesture and demonstration and the pointing of fingers at specific points in the ground. Marta watched his proposed channel location, then took a spade and extended it 6 inches further and cut a small collection depression at the downhill end. Don looked at this for a moment and then nodded once. The modification prevented fine sand from washing out of the base of the south wall during spring snowmelt. Neither of them mentioned who had thought of which part. The drainage worked. Boyd Wren built his own structure that spring, the 5th such building within 15 miles of Ord. Agnes Wren brought Lucy a Welsh currant bread at the framing, and Lucy brought it home, and Marta ate a piece of it at the table and said something in Czech that Lucy did not translate for me until years later. She had said, "The bread is good. The family will be all right." By 1885, there were 11 earth-sheltered cattle structures of this general type within the area I traveled regularly for work. Nobody called the design by Marta's name. It was called Sandhills Building, or sometimes just called Sensible, which is perhaps the highest designation a practical idea can receive in a community that does not have time for more elaborate praise. I went back to the hill in the summer of 1912, the same week I began telling this story. The structure itself has been gone for 14 years, taken by the spring flood of 1898, which came down the draw with more force than anyone anticipated and undercut the hillside 30 feet in either direction from where the south frame had stood. Lucy and her husband had moved the cattle out 2 days before, reading the snowmelt correctly, and nothing living was lost. But the building was gone, dissolved back into the hill from which it had come. The cottonwood frame rotted, and the sod indistinguishable from the surrounding slope. What remains is a slight depression in the hillside, half concealed by the bluestem grass that has re-established itself across the old excavation. You would not notice it unless you knew to look. I crouched down and pressed my wrist into the ground at the edge of the depression, 4 inches down, where the soil was cool and dark. The temperature came through the skin of my inner wrist, the way Marta had described it 33 years earlier, not as a number, but as a fact, steady and unhurried, the deep ground communicating what it had always communicated to anyone patient enough to ask, that below the reach of the frost, the earth holds its own warmth regardless of what the sky is doing. She had known this in September of 1879. She had stood on this hill with her hands in her apron and her eyes on the ground and known it, not from a book, not from a set of drawings, but from her father's hands and his father's before him, from the particular intelligence that accumulates in a family over generations of building with the earth rather than on top of it. I built more than 100 structures in this county over 35 years. Most of them are gone or going. The frame barn I considered my best work developed a foundation crack in 1903 and had to be pulled down. The storage sheds I built with the best cottonwood I could source have required continuous maintenance as the wood has checked and the boards have separated and the winters have found the gaps. The knowledge that Marta Sedlak brought from Moravia and read into the sandhill soil is still here. It is in the 11 structures built during her lifetime and the ones built by men who learned from those. It is in the drainage modification Dan Hook devised and the ventilation principle that Lucy eventually wrote down in a letter to a cousin in Iowa who was asking about cattle shelter. It is in the ground itself, which has not changed its temperature at depth and will not, regardless of what any of us build on top of it. I stayed crouched on that hillside for a while, with my wrist against the earth and the late summer light coming long and level across the grass. 39 degrees, the same as it had been in January of 1880, when the rest of the county was counting its dead cattle, and I was standing in the doorway of a packed earth structure reading a thermometer for the third time because I could not quite accept what it said. The ground kept its temperature. It had always kept it. She had simply been the one to listen.